Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Food Security for Equitable Futures expert interview video series. Here we interview experts in the field of food insecurity to gain a non technical overview of this pressing social problem. Experts share their ground level experiences with food insecurity and discuss the ways to address it. I am Swayamshree, a postdoctoral research scholar working on this project with IIT Kanpur and Lancaster University in the UK. I am happy to be here with a leading expert in food insecurity. Let's begin by welcoming him. Welcome, Professor. Could you please tell us about yourself, name and current institution, your areas of interest?
Well, my name is R. Ramkumar. I am an economist by training and I'm a professor at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. I've been here for the last 17 years or so, and I largely work on issues related to agricultural economics, agrarian studies, rural development, and so on. That's my area of work. I teach in a program called Development Studies, which has a master's as well as PhD component to it. I largely teach courses related to economics to students from different disciplinary backgrounds because the course essentially is an interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary course.
Since we are talking about food insecurity, particularly for this project, I wanted to know what is your experience working on food insecurity? And you are already in an interdisciplinary setup. So, how do you look at food insecurity through an interdisciplinary lens?
So I have looked at the question of food insecurity from different angles, so to say. Of course, I don't work on each and every aspect of food insecurity that's yeah, in the literature or that's in the scholarship. Uh, I largely work on three or four areas related to food insecurity or food security. The first is the question of uh, the sufficiency of production to ensure food security to all. Uh, I do believe that at the national level, countries must have substantial self-sufficiency in production of food grains. India, for instance, had a very difficult time in the 1960s when it was deficient in overall food production. The lesson learned by India at that time was that political sovereignty and food security are related. So, for example, the debate during the 1960s in India was that if India does not devalue its currency or implement certain policies that the United States or the West wanted it to do, uh, food aid to India under programs like PL 480 would be stopped or would be slowed down. So the absence of food insecurity, or I'm sorry, the absence of food security is often intertwined with questions of political sovereignty. And I think that this must be one important aim of countries to achieve self sufficiency or substantial self sufficiency in production of basic staple food grains. I'm not saying countries have to be autarkic or anything, but there will be needs to import certain food items from other regions or other countries and so on. But substantial food security would be very essential for political sovereignty. So I look at the question of overall production sufficiency very seriously. I have looked at the question of India more in greater detail. I have written about how India attained food self-sufficiency over the last 30 to 40 years, and also in the more recent years, are there any threats that are coming up in maintaining that food self-sufficiency? Number one. Number two is the question of expanding out of food grain self-sufficiency in terms of production alone to distribution. There again, I have done some work on the nature of food grain insufficiency in India, the different adverse health outcomes or nutritional outcomes that it leads to, and what kind of public policy responses are necessary to address this concern. Now, regarding this, I must say that about a third of infants born in India are either underweight or stunted or suffer from different kinds of malnourishment. And I think that this is despite the fact that India has attained self-sufficiency in food production in a substantial sense. This is a question of distribution. Now, we know that distribution is not always a question of sufficiency of production. It's also a question of whether people have entitlements, in to use a term that Amartya Sen has often used. So entitlements are linked to the nature of livelihoods people are engaged in, the extent of income that they earn, the extent of employment security that they have. So it's a larger question which is linked to a number of socio-economic issues in the economy and society. So this is a second important matter that I have concerned myself with. The third important matter that I have concerned myself with is the question of public distribution system, which is a very important element of public policy in India in terms of ensuring food security. I have looked at the overall functioning of PDS in the country as a whole. I have also, more specifically in this context, looked at one state where the public distribution system emerged for the first time, and it probably works best in India, which is Kerala. So I have looked at the public distribution system in Kerala very closely. I have tried to trace its history in terms of how it was born during the period of Second World War, how progressive public policy has led to its universalization and institutionalization on the ground, and how it continues to serve people in a very commendable way. The final question is a more philosophical one, where I have looked at the question of whether such systems of food security, such as PDS, must be universal or targeted in its implementation. I've always argued that such systems must be universal. It must not be subjected to a means test. It must not be subjected to targeting of any form, because there are enormous errors of exclusion that result from the institution of targeting in such schemes. There is substantial self-selection that is already from the part of the rich, and I don't think it's necessary to worry about the insignificant fiscal costs while compared to the significant social costs that might result from errors of exclusion. So that's also something that I have worked on in the past.
Thank you for discussing about food insecurity in such a contextual manner. And I just wanted to know, since you have so much experience working with food insecurity, and you have seen as food insecurity not just as a social problem, but also as a political problem, I just wanted to know, who are the people who are most impacted by food insecurity? And what are the ways forward, if there are ways forward?
Well, I think different sections of the society are differently impacted by the problem of food insecurity. Uh, if you decide to include imbalance in consumption also as a part of food insecurity, then we are looking at not just the poor in the society, but also probably the rich, where questions of obesity and all have come up in the recent past as a very important concern. So if you look at food security or insecurity in a larger context, which includes the healthy nature of the diet and so on, then we are looking at a larger canvas. But the way I have looked at it is in terms of how it impacts the poor. And I think the poor in India, the income poor in India, are substantially affected by food insecurity. By this, I don't mean it simply in class terms, but I also mean it in caste terms and gender terms. Because if you look at it closely, it is not just the income poor that is poor in an economic sense who are affected most by food insecurity. They are substantially affected, but there's also a substantial overlap here between those who are income poor and those who belong to the backward socioeconomic sections, economically backward socioeconomic sections like Dalits, Adivasis, etc., and also poorer sections of other backward communities. So these constitute the income poor, as well as those who are exploited or discriminated against in the socio-economic sphere that we have. Now, if you come to gender, I think the canvas becomes wider. Because about 60 to 65% of women in India are found to be anemic, for example. Now, this is a question of food insecurity as well. It's a dimension of food insecurity as well. So these 60% of women that we are talking about are not necessarily the income poor that we are talking about. So while women from the income poor sections are substantially involved in this category, there are also many women from the economically forward communities who are affected by adverse health outcomes such as anemia. So you are looking at a very complex scenario here. If you are looking at the quantity consumed, if you are looking at the insufficiency of the quantity consumed, you will see that in class and caste terms, that's a clearly identifiable category, that is income poor, and in caste terms, Dalits, Adivasis, and those from the poorer OBC sections and so on, who are affected by food insecurity substantially. But if you bring in gender into that question, there are also women from other communities who are. So it's a very complex matter, and that is why it is also to be admitted and appreciated that food insecurity or security is not simply a social or economic problem. It is probably also a cultural problem. It is also linked to cultural variables in a substantive way. Why do we say that? This is primarily because the way diets are formed, the diets are constituted and have evolved in India, have much to do with the cultural background in which people come from. So people from certain communities in some states prefer certain types of diet. And this has led to difficulties in terms of, let's say, a form of path dependence sets in here. That is, it's very difficult for people to move out of certain diets, however insufficient they might be, however inadequate they may be in a nutritional sense, to come out of it and begin to consume a healthier, more balanced diet. And so it is not, even if food grain self-sufficiency is made possible, or access is made possible in a physical sense, because of the rigidity of certain diet patterns, because of cultural reasons, there are impediments that are very clearly there in terms of how food security can be addressed. So that's why I say it's a very complex matter that we have. So if you ask, who are the food insecure in India? The answer is not straightforward, but the answer is straightforward in one sense. That is, it is the poor who are substantially affected by food insecurity. But if you ask the question, is it the poor, or is it only the poor who are affected by food insecurity? The answer would be not necessarily in the affirmative. That is why, this is precisely why people like me have argued for universalism in food in policies related to food security. Targeting would mean that you are trying to keep out only a very small section of people from the ambit of policies related to food security. So if you ensure that only BPL sections will get certain benefits related to food security, or certain subsidies and so on, essentially what you're doing is you are covering as about 75 to 80% of the population. So you create a large administrative mechanism, and the costs involved with it are incurred in order to keep out 20%. Right? And this 20% is anyway not interested in accessing those benefits, so they will essentially self-select them out of the food security schemes. So you don't need to exclude them; they are automatically excluded by certain voluntariness. I'll give you an example. If you look at the public distribution system in India, if you keep it universal, will the rich households of India go to a ration shop, stand in a queue, and buy food grains, which according to them are inferior in quality and so on? Right? Experience shows they don't go to the ration shop. They prefer to buy from a local grocery shop and either gift it to their house helps and so on, or simply don't utilize that subsidy. So you don't need to target, because people largely self-select them out. It is automatically reaching only those who are needy, so to say, in the new parlance. So universalism is also always a much better option in countries like India, where substantial sections of people are both poor and food insecure. And this is why I think public policy must be geared towards provisions in food provisions in policies related to food security, which do not involve any forms of means test. That is something that I must underline here.
Yeah, I think there are so many things going on here, and you have sort of complicated our understanding of food insecurity and how it should be more inclusive and universal in nature. Probably it's better to include everybody rather than excluding a certain section of the population.
Let me
And also,
supplement that with this point, small
yes,
point. In the literature, if you see, just like in statistics, we've got false positives and false negatives. We speak about errors of exclusion and errors of inclusion here. And, beginning from Professor Cornea's work in the 1980s, there is substantial appreciation in the literature today that errors of exclusion have social costs, while errors of inclusion only have fiscal costs. Right? And if you, by a certain framework of justice that you follow, prioritize social costs over fiscal costs, then universalism is the best way to follow. Right? It's only a matter of spending a little more. It doesn't matter, because if you don't spend that little more in order to make the system universal, there'll be substantial social costs which would which must be unacceptable given a certain framework of justice that you might want to follow.
that's so true. Um, and also that food is a cultural thing, and so we can't ignore the structure in which we all are situated, and that structure probably needs a lot of highlighting and focus. We can't decontextualize probably the situation. Thank you. Now I just wanted to know, what do you think is the biggest food insecurity challenge that India would face probably in the next few years, in the short term or in the long term, if you want to highlight some of the challenges that we should be careful about?
Well, let me begin with a very simple point, which is that there is a feeling, or there is a view that appears to be very common, that India does not need to increase the production of rice and wheat anymore, that there is a structural surplus that exists in the Indian economy vis-a-vis rice and wheat. I think that such views are a little premature. So such conclusions, may I say, are a bit premature, primarily because if you actually look at how much must a person consume in order to live a healthy life or to consume a healthy diet, and keep that as the benchmark, which we are far from, of course. That's why we have so much of malnourishment. And then try to look at how much food grains would be required. Then by 2035 or 2036 or 2050, however you want to put it in the future, uh, the current rates of growth of food grain production are necessary, in the sense that if you discourage cultivation of paddy or wheat in certain parts of the country, uh, under the impression that we already have a surplus, then you might be looking at a deficit in the near future. So there are many ways of looking at it. One is that even if some regions, or let's say Punjab, okay, that's something that everybody talks about. Should Punjab cultivate rice because its water consumption is high and so on? Fair enough. If Punjab has to move out of paddy cultivation, there are a few things that you want to look at. One, what will Punjab farmers do in that land? Okay, that's a Punjab problem. Let's say they must cultivate more of maize in the paddy lands that they have. The question then that arises is, would then farmers in Punjab have the same amount of price security that they have today vis-a-vis the MSP in paddy if they cultivate maize? And will it be as economical or profitable as rice? Can there be an income neutrality in the outcomes in Punjab if there is a change in cropping pattern? It's the government that has to answer that, number one. Now, in other places of India, other parts of India, where there's already rice cultivation, you might want to increase productivity because our productivity levels in many regions are very low compared to national standards or even global standards. So there are many strategies that you must adopt to increase paddy and wheat production, which are the main staple food grains that we are talking of in the near future. So an amount of complacency must not step in into public policy under the impression that we already have a structural surplus in the major staple food grains. Number one. Number two is that we need to expand the cultivation of other cereals and millets that we have, which are highly nutritious and which once were part of diets, have moved out, but is now returning, but only in a niche form, not in a mass form. Right? I'm talking about jowar or ragi and crops like that, which have moved out of diets substantially, which are nutritious crops, but bringing them back into the diet is not purely a matter of cultural uh, mindset changes. It is also a question of how you place public policy. Now we are celebrating the International Year of Millets this year. Now, what does it take to cultivate millets in India? What does it take to substitute another crop and cultivate millets in their place? The farmer must have the same level of profits, right? Unless the farmer has the same level of profit, why would he substitute an existing crop and plant a millet just because it's the International Year of Millets? Right? So the public policy then has to make sure that this assured income, however it is assured, the public policy can have different ways of achieving it. It can be through a good MSP, it can be through procurement, or it could be ensuring some other market, whatever it is. But the point is, such spread of new crops, even if it's millets or maybe some pulses and so on, can happen only if the farmers are assured of a good income. Right? And that's where public policy has to reframe itself in terms of how cropping pattern changes can be made possible, uh, ensuring that incomes of farmers are not adversely affected. That would be another important public policy concern for me. So do we need a cropping pattern change in India? Yes, slowly it's time that we are thinking about such a change, but it takes enormous amount of policy emphasis to do that. It's not enough to talk about it. It's not enough to uh, exhort people to do it. Public policy, just as it played a significant role in the 1960s to spread the cultivation of paddy and wheat, must play an equally emphatic role today uh, to ensure that such cropping patterns are also possible on the ground. Right. So this is a second important concern that I have for the near future. The third important concern that I have in the near future is that would we be able to uh, sort of ameliorate or deal with the challenges of climate change and other new areas of concern that have come up, and maintain production and productivity the same way that we have in the past. That is another concern. This is where science will play a very important role. New technologies will play a very important role. In my view, there has to be a more intensive and rational application of science and technology in agriculture, in a mass sense, to ensure that farmers are able to meet the new biotic and abiotic stresses that will come up in cultivation, and ensure that farmers are able to maintain production and productivity. So substantial public investment must also go into agricultural science, to ensure that we have new varieties, new hybrids, new forms of plant types, including through new technologies like gene editing and so on. How do we create new seeds which are resistant to flooding, which are resistant to salinity, which are resistant to acidity, and so on and so forth? That is yet another concern that I have for the near future.
Thank you. So you sort of tying it back to from where you began about livelihood, protecting livelihood, even though there can be a change in the nature of crops that we cultivate, it sort of has to compensate farmers adequately, and they should be motivated to go down that path as well. Um, so interesting just to hear you speak and like link everything together. You have worked in Kerala, and I just wanted to know that what are the other type of geographies in terms of space that you have covered in India, and specific problems to these particular spaces? And my second question would be, you talked about climate change and cropping pattern and agriculture. At this point, can you see any negative impact of climate change on agriculture, particularly in India, any type of geography within India? So just your views on it.
So I have essentially looked at national data as well as Kerala data very intensively, but I've also done some comparative work, though I've not done ground level field work in other states on PDS, though I worked on other areas, but not on questions of food security or insecurity. And I must say that the data that we see across states show substantial variations, right? And that's something very important about India. There are some states, Kerala is one, Tamil Nadu is another. There are some states like this where the implementation of PDS is commendable. And something that other states can actually learn a lot from. And both these states, if you look closely, have ensured that they don't target their populations unnecessarily. They keep universalism close to their chest, and most of their policies related to PDS are universal in nature. They cover almost everyone or substantial sections of the population. So that's one. The second is the level of corruption that is involved, the level of leakages and other issues that are involved in the implementation of PDS. Here also there are variations across states, whereby you will see that in states where they worked well, the very important feature of that working well is also clean administration, is also a political will to keep corruption out of such systems. Also, if you look at the literature on this matter, you will see over the years the extent of corruption that is involved in PDS has begun to come down. Okay, and that's a product of a number of factors. One of them is that there is enormous food security has over a period of time in India become a political issue. There are civil society campaigns, political campaigns, etc., by parties included, which have been happened in this sphere. And what you see as a result is that there is an awareness that has been built across societies that this is a very important area, that we have been inflicted with a lot of corruption, and it must come down. Okay, so there's something, there's an overwatch that is there and which has helped, not substantially, but to an extent, yes. So that's the first thing that I see. The second thing that I see is many states have used different types of technologies to computerize PDS systems and so on, which have also helped to plug corruption to some extent. So it's a product of a lot of things that have come together in the last few years, including, for example, or not for example, including undoubtedly the National Food Security Act of 2013, which ensured that a certain section of the rural and urban population are compulsorily covered under the ambit of the PDS. That has also helped. So all these have come together to create create an improvement. And I'm not here to quantify that improvement, but there's some improvement clearly in the working of the PDS across states. And that's something that is commendable and welcome. And that's a good change that has happened in this area. So you were asking me whether there are already any substantial impacts that we see of climate change. So it's still unclear. So the one thing that we must remember from our school textbooks is the difference between climate and weather, right? Climate is something that happens over, say, at least 30 years, right? And weather is something that happens now. Okay, today, tomorrow, next year, and so on. So by weather, we are looking at a shorter time span, and climate, we are looking at a longer time span of at least 30 years. So if you go strictly by that framework, an impact of climate change should be consistently visible for a very long period of time, of at least 3 decades. We are not there yet. So we still are not able to pinpoint what is happening in climate change and agriculture, but we have some indications. We don't know whether they will persist. We don't know whether they will stay with us on a permanent basis and so on. What we see, for example, is the frequency of extreme climate events are probably rising. Okay, floods, summer rains, these kinds of uh, hailstorms, these kinds of extreme events that happen are rising, and there is some impact that is felt in agriculture. There also some impact that we feel in agriculture with respect to the spread of rainfall within a year. So annual rainfalls don't change much, but the distribution across months change, because of which farmers have had to shift, play with seasons, and delay sowing, or sort of ensure advanced sowing, or things of that sort. So such impacts are also very clearly visible in some areas. In fisheries and so on, spawning seasons or breeding seasons have changed. They've moved up and down, and farmers have had to adjust. So there are some impacts that are visible, but we do not know whether we can call them climate change as yet, because we need more time. But they have been with us for a while, for sure. So we have some indications of climate variabilities, but not necessarily substantial evidence on climate change as regards how they will affect agriculture, right? There are projections on how glaciers will melt and so on, and how that can lead to floods or droughts in certain regions as opposed to other regions. These are currently, they're not speculations, they are educated guesses at this point, based on scientific modeling procedures, but we still need time to pinpoint what exactly would be the impact of climate change on agriculture. But we must expect that problems of salinity, problems of flooding, problems of drought, problems of acidity, etc., are likely to rise. And that's where science and technology must be prepared to face that future task.
Right. It has to be an integrative approach where we
Absolutely.
go together with science and technology. Climate change is one of the processes that could have an impact probably on food insecurity. Yet has to be seen. There are other few things that have really impacted the situation of food in India. Like I was going through your articles, you have written a lot about the impact of COVID-19 on agriculture. So if you would want to discuss your experience with it, or how you saw this entire situation.
I have largely relied on published material on this. I also work closely with groups of people who have done surveys of households, including through telephonic surveys and so on. Let me summarize it this way. What surveys do show is that there was a sharp deterioration of household food security during the pandemic. That's something that is undoubtedly the case. Even though the government of India did increase the supply of food grains and so on through the PDS, there was substantial food insecurity during the pandemic. So surveys show very clearly that there has been, which try to quantify the household food consumption, show a fall of household food consumption, as well as a decline in the diversity of food that was consumed. So total quantity has come down, and the diversity of food consumption has also come down. Similar results are also available from the surveys conducted by World Bank. There are also telephonic surveys. They found, for example, that the share of rural households with at least one sign of food insecurity was about 47% in the month of May 2020, which even by September or October of 2020 was about 15 to 20%. So households with at least one sign of food insecurity was 20%. Now, the share of households that reported reduced size of meals was about 1/4 in May 2020, and it was still about 15% in September and October of 2020. So a lot of studies of this sort actually show that household food consumption did come down during the pandemic, and the expansion of PDS was useful, but much more should have been done to ensure that food insecurity was better dealt with. This is where I think we fell back a little bit in during the pandemic. I think while the decision to supply 5 kilograms of food grains free was a good decision, welcome decision, but I think we could have done a little more than that, because we had food stocks at that time to deal with that kind of food insecurity, and we could have pushed in more food grains through the PDS into the hands of people. So that's something that I do feel very strongly about the problem of food insecurity during the pandemic.
I was just wanting to know that if you see any linkages between global events and their impact on the food security or insecurity situation in our country at the moment, social, political, or economic, something in the global level that is impacting the local, anything on those lines.
Oh yes. I think by the time the world was beginning to emerge out of the COVID-19 pandemic and the socio-economic crisis that it created, there have been 2 or 3 new shocks that have hit the global economy. And they are clearly in the fields of food, fertilizer, and fuel, in my view. And this is something that has exacerbated due to the conflict that you have in Ukraine. So it's important to remember that many parts of the world were on the verge of a food crisis even prior to the Ukraine war. And the conflict actually made a bad situation even worse. That's what we see from all the data. The problem here is that Russia and Ukraine together constitute about or contribute about 30% of the wheat production, 20% of the maize production, and about 70% or so of the food of the total production of sunflower that is traded globally. So when the war began, you see ports in the Black Sea region were shut down. Grain, vegetable oil, or other food items produced in Ukraine and Russia faced different disruptions in their supply chains. Monthly exports of grain from Ukraine have fallen, if I remember correctly, from about 6 million metric tons before the war to about 1 or 2 million metric tons after the war. So if you look at these data points that we have across the world, the beginning of the war in Ukraine has meant that the total inflow of grains into the world market has come down. There have been enormous supply chain disruptions also, number one. Number two, because these two countries are also major producers and exporters of fertilizers. For example, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus are centers of mining. They produce a lot of potash for the world economy. Russia is also a major producer of natural gas, which is also a raw material in producing nitrogenous fertilizer. So this has also meant that world prices of fertilizers have increased by about 200% in the last 1 year or so. And along with the food shock that we have had, this fertilizer shock is also something that has hit the world economy hard, and that is something that we are having a lot of difficulty with at this moment. So if you ask me what is the crisis that we are facing now, I would say the food shock and the fertilizer shock are the two important shocks that we have in the world economy today. The war in Ukraine has much to do with it, and that's essentially why I think the world political community must come together, put Russia and Ukraine on two sides of the table, and create a solution that is acceptable to both and which is commensurate with the re-establishment of peace in the region.
Right, right. This takes me to the second last question. Um, uh, we have talked about the role of government in terms of a universal and an inclusive approach. So I was just thinking, any other aspects that the government should focus on, and what would be the role of non-government agencies in this situation?
Well, let's talk about the government first. I think the government must look carefully at the larger social policy that it follows in addressing food insecurity. For example, investments in education, health are very important if you look at food insecurity or security. That's primarily because investments in health are important in improving the question of food absorption, right? So it's not adequate that food is consumed. Food must also be absorbed into your body, and there the better health of a person plays a very important role. So public policy in terms of investments in health play a very important role in improving food absorption, and thus improving health outcomes. Investment in education, particularly female education, increases awareness about different health issues or food consumption issues. It plays a role in reducing anemia, for example, among women and so on. So that's also something that has linkages with uh, the problem of food security. A good social security system, that is, which provides education, health, etc., free to people, allows people to save the money that they would otherwise pay to private hospitals or private schools and so on, and divert that money for consumption of more food items. That's also what the global evidence shows. The money that people save because education and health become free are always diverted to causes like better food consumption, and that's also a good thing. So if the governments are ensuring the establishment of a good social security system that is universal, that can also help in improving food security on the other side. Non-governmental groups, how can they help? They can play a very important role. They are currently playing a very important role in, for example, if you look at the right to food movement in India, which is a very good example, you will see that political parties, I mean, for example, the progressive political parties have joined hands with uh, non-governmental groups, which have all federated into the Right to Food Initiative in India, and actively advocated universalism in food security policies, have actively advocated more investments in education, health, and social security, in paying good pensions to the elderly, and so on. So you will see that there is enormous importance, or there's a very important role that advocacy can play in this regard, when political parties and the civil society movements come together. That includes non-governmental groups that come together and create more awareness, not just among the population per se, but also among the policymakers, the bureaucrats. What are the best practices? What is to be done in where must policy place emphasis? Or where must more investment go? So all these are areas where a good civil society movement can actually play a very important role. And I think it's very important, as is the importance of the political system, political parties, and so on.
It has to be probably a holistic approach where several actors have to come in together, but the primary role could be played by the government.
That's right.
Okay. Professor, I just wanted to know, what are your future plans for research on food insecurity? Anything that you're thinking of in terms of project, or any new aspect of food insecurity that you are looking at? Just a few lines.
Well, I do work on agricultural economics, and matters of food security do come in very often into my frame of work. So, some work that I'm currently doing is related to village studies in India, particularly where the state where I live, Maharashtra. And what we actually find is that uh, uh, we uh, we ask a lot of questions about food consumption, food security, nature of PDS, and so on. So while we look at overall socioeconomic questions in village India, we also study matters related to PDS, which is a problem of food security, and that's something that I wish to continue in the near future. And I also have some research interest in the history of PDS in India, the way the PDS has evolved over the years in different contexts across the country, to document those concerns and so on. That's something that's also, well, in the near future, uh, is part of my research interest. But let's hope that I'm able to actually realize them in, in reality as well.
No, certainly, I look forward to following your work in future. And these are all of my questions for now. And it has been a very insightful experience in thinking about food insecurity in a very situated yet a very holistic term. So thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us.
My pleasure. Enjoyed it. Thank you very much.